It's really frightening. It just goes to show you that they are predators, these individuals who are being charged with these crimes.
A former New Jersey teacher is slammed with another round of sex crimes charges after a second former student comes forward with shocking allegations.
When there's multiple, now you're dealing with almost like a different profile of this defendant, of this person as a predator, as somebody who is taking advantage perhaps of multiple young children.
Experts say these new charges only make things worse for the now disgraced former teacher.
It's really problematic for this woman who's being charged because the more people who come forward and give credible accounts of their experiences with her, the more likely it is that a jury is going to believe that she did this.
We're hearing from criminal defense attorney and former sex crimes prosecutor Serena Townsend about everything we know so far.
But on these teacher cases, it's almost like there was a reason why they became a teacher, it seems. Like they wanted to have this access to multiple potential victims. And that's what we're seeing. It's going to look very bad for her in court.
Law&Crime first reported on the story of Julie Rizzitello early this month. On July 3rd, the 36-year-old was arrested and charged. It was around this same time that Rizzitello put in her notice, resigning from her position as an English teacher at Wall High School in East New Jersey. According to an affidavit, Rizzitello had a sexual relationship with one of her former students between April and June 14th of this year. She was charged with 2 counts of sexual assault and then 3 counts of criminal sexual contact. What is the difference there between the assault and the contact charges?
So it all depends. Every state has kind of different laws with respect to sexual assault. And it depends on the actual act that occurred. So sometimes you have a greater degree of felony if one part of someone's body touches another part of someone's body. And so it oftentimes relates to the types of sexual acts that occur. And then again, you also have the type of sexual crime that is charged when you are in a certain position of power, like she is. And so it'll depend on kind of the evidence that they've uncovered, what exactly she did or what this person is claiming she did. And that will determine which charges are going to be put forth.
According to court documents, Rizzitello allegedly engaged in various sexual acts with the victim on multiple occasions and in at least 3 jurisdictions. The survivor was 18 years old during the alleged assaults, but it's still considered a crime because Rizzitello had a supervisory or disciplinary power over him. The documents specifically point to May 14th, when Rizzitello and the former student allegedly had a sexual encounter in his car. She also allegedly sent the survivor naked pictures of herself and later asked him to delete the pics just one day before she was arrested and booked into jail. But just 2 weeks after she was first charged, Rizzitello was charged again.
It's not that common, but I am seeing it more and more often these days, particularly in these cases with these female teachers. It's really frightening. It just goes to show you that they are predators, these individuals who are being charged with these crimes. Usually on a sex crimes case, you see one defendant, one potential victim or survivor. But on these teacher cases, it's almost like there was a reason why they became a teacher, it seems. Like they wanted to have this access to multiple potential victims. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing these students come forward, and it's hardly ever just one when it's a student.
The fact that there are 2 students or former student accusers in this instance, does that bolster the case for the prosecution to kind of show that this is some sort of pattern?
It definitely does. It's really problematic for this woman who's being charged because the more people who come forward and give credible accounts of their experiences with her, the more likely it is that a jury is going to believe that she did this. There are laws and rules that say that you can't introduce other prior bad acts of a defendant, for example. But if they're actually charged with those acts in an indictment, you can introduce all of the evidence that you want on all of those acts. So it's going to look very bad for her in court.
In the second case, Rizzitello faces similar charges to the first. I asked Townsend to explain this. She was charged with 1 count of second-degree sexual assault and then 1 count of third-degree tampering. Can you break down those charges for me?
Sure. Well, the sexual assault charge comes from her position as a teacher. It's my understanding that not only did she have sexual contact with students who may have been underage, at least at some point in the relationship, but there's actually a separate crime in and of itself, even if the student was of age, that she's being charged with simply by the fact that she was in a position of power. She had the power to supervise and discipline these individuals as their teacher. And because of that, because of her position and their position, it is in fact a crime, even if they attained legal status of their age. So she's being charged with sexual assault because of that. And then with respect to tampering, which is so unfortunate because, as a former sex crimes prosecutor, I used to charge crimes like this all of the time, but it was very rare to also have a tampering charge on top of the actual sex crime, particularly between adults. But you see, between these teachers and their students, or teachers and children, that there's oftentimes this added aspect of the witness tampering. And here it's because she's asked that student to delete certain pictures or text messages that they had, which is evidence of the crime. So she's actually asking them to destroy evidence, and that is tampering with evidence and witness tampering.
Officials say the second accuser came forward after Rizzitello's arrest, when she was first charged for the sexual relationship that allegedly started this spring. But these second set of allegations have a different timeline. For this new round of charges, the allegations date back to 2017, so kind of a while ago. Does that make things more difficult in terms of the prosecution against her?
So yeah, anytime a case comes forward a little later and the outcry, for example, is late or delayed, there are certain individuals on a jury who might look at that and say, "Well, why didn't they say something sooner?" But we know, again, as a former prosecutor and somebody who specializes in sex crimes, that it is not actually that odd for somebody to come forward years later under certain circumstances, triggering things that cause them to say something that they otherwise did not say sooner. That being said, when there is a delay, it also means that there is potentially spoliation of evidence, right? And so, where evidence could have been detected if the outcry was sooner, it may not exist now, whether that's physical evidence, biological evidence, text messages, cell phones that may have been discarded, things of that nature. And of course, people's memory decays over time, so it is a little bit harder for the prosecution. But that being said, when there are multiple victims, that bolsters the prosecution. So it's kind of a give and take.
As part of the investigation into Rizzitello, more charges could be filed down the line. Is it possible that investigators dig into the background of other students and ask around, hey, has anyone seen anything? Could there be more survivors?
Absolutely. And if they're doing the right thing and they're doing a good job, they will do a thorough, unbiased investigation. Once you start seeing that it's multiple people, again, if it's one, then, maybe somebody could chalk it up to, well, she just focused in on this one person. But when there's multiple, now you're dealing with a almost like a different profile of this defendant, of this person, as a predator, as somebody who is taking advantage perhaps of multiple young children, and it's really a problem. And the investigation has to be as thorough as possible. And yeah, they're going to do interviews, and they'll probably ask the two people who came forward, "Hey, do you know of anybody else that this might have happened to?" And they might start their investigation that way.
Of the dozens of teacher stories we've covered here at Law&Crime, we've seen that pattern before. After one accuser comes forward, others may soon follow. But the one thing that's different about Rizzitello's case is that at least one accuser was over 18 years old at the time of the incidents. I'm wondering, just to play devil's advocate, if her defense could say, we didn't even know that that was against the law. He was 18. We thought it was legal. Is that something that her defense is likely to come forward and say?
It's possible, but I don't think it will fly because ignorance is actually not defense. It is the law, and the law is the law, and you're imputed with that knowledge. As a teacher, you are imputed with the knowledge that this is against the law. Most likely, the truth is, if I'm the prosecutor, I'm also digging into the training materials of teachers, the certificate that she's received. I am sure, at least I would hope, that when she was trained, that they explained to these teachers in training what is allowed and what is not allowed. I mean, you would hope it's obvious, but also for liability purposes, I would expect that she was trained in this and that she absolutely should have known. But even if she didn't, the law is the law.
So, if she can't use ignorance as some sort of defense, is there any defense you could see her using that she could have the charges dismissed or be found not guilty?
The only thing that I could imagine at this point is that she's going to have to claim that the students are lying. That's probably why she tried to get them to delete the text messages or any other evidence, because if there's no solid evidence coming from her phone, for example, acknowledging the relationship, she could basically try to say anything and say, look, these kids, they didn't like me. Maybe I was a harsh grader, or they're just trying to take advantage. And kids, like they'll make up anything. So she could probably try to go with that, because the only other thing typically you can go with in a defense is like, it wasn't me, or there was a false identification. But she's obviously well known to these students. So it's not like, oh, someone, sprung at them in the middle of the night and they had a hard time seeing their face. Obviously, if they say that it was her, it's going to be quite a hard defense for her. I think the defense is going to try to get her as low an offer as possible from the prosecution and try to strike a deal.
Townsend theorizes that Rizzitello's case won't make it to trial, but instead will end with a plea. What sort of plea deal do you think it could look like then?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Look, they're going to probably try to mitigate this by saying, hey, it's not like these other cases that we've heard of where the teacher is sexually assaulting a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old. They'll say, like, hey, we understand that it is technically against the law, but this person was an adult. He was able to make, adult decisions. Um, I think that, it's still against the law, obviously, and the prosecution is not going to dismiss the case for that, but they might take age into consideration. The defense might also say, look, she has no prior record. She can be rehabilitated, send her to a program. But if I'm the prosecution, I'm certainly not going to allow her to take any sort of deal where she doesn't have to register as a sex offender. I think that's going to be on the table no matter what.
So, with that in mind, her registering as a sex offender, if a plea deal is reached or if she is found guilty, if it goes to jury trial, then I can assume, is it safe to assume, I guess, that she would never be allowed to teach again?
Absolutely. I think also part of the deal would be kind of a giving up of her teaching license. But, if you're convicted of a crime like that, for the most part, you're going to get that license taken away from you anyway, from, the board that looks over teachers and makes those kinds of decisions. But sure. And if you have to register as a sex offender, there are so many rules that you have to follow, including staying away from schools and children. So, yes, I think it is safe to say that as long as she's found guilty somehow, whether it's through a plea deal or through a jury trial, we're not going to see this woman in a school again, at least not if she's following the law.
But if Rizzitello doesn't opt for a plea deal, Townsend says prosecutors have a decent amount of evidence on their side. And in terms of her being found guilty one way or another, I do feel like the prosecution has a pretty strong case because they have these photos, this text conversation, and then additionally, they have her saying to this former student, hey, can you delete these texts, get rid of these photos slash videos, whatever it may be. So that to me is almost an admittance that she knows something is wrong. What do you make of it?
It absolutely is. And at trial, what the prosecution would ask the judge to do is to actually instruct the jury that it kind of is a confession. It's what we call consciousness of guilt. And there's a specific kind of instruction that a judge gives to a jury about that. And they say, you could take into account what her actions were after the event to determine guilt as well, to determine kind of what her mindset was, and to determine her credibility. So, if I'm the prosecutor in that case, I'm going to argue to the jury, you don't have to necessarily even just take the student's word for it. You can see based on her actions after the fact that she knew that she did the wrong thing. And that's why she said to delete the damning evidence.
And that damning evidence, we have photos, at least according to an affidavit. There are photos that, again, bolster the prosecution's case. And this is something I've seen in a pattern. I cover a lot of cases like this on Law and Crime, unfortunately. But oftentimes we see teachers who willingly take photos and videos and send them to their students. And to me, it's so shocking because it's clear evidence. Why would they take this photo?
I have no idea. I am telling you, I see it all the time. Also, I was a prosecutor for 10 years. I'm a defense attorney now. I oversaw Rikers Island internal affairs, and people do things on video when they know they're being videoed. I don't understand it at all. The metadata exists. Even if you delete it, your phone can be dumped. And you have to understand, especially if you're sending it to another person, you have now given up control of that content. You better trust that person with your life if you're going to send them something like that. So, yeah, I do not know. It just goes to show kind of the almost mental breakdown, or just, kind of this idea of they're not really thinking straight when they're committing these acts, and post facto doing these things of taking photos and asking for them to be deleted. Especially if you're asking via text, it's the same thing. It's same metadata that's going to be found out. It is, people really should understand and appreciate that those kinds of things will be found out. They just simply will. You have to act like they will be found out.
In addition to that evidence, there's also witness testimony. We predicted that the case would likely end in a plea deal, but let's say that it doesn't, that it goes to a jury trial. Do you think it's possible that the witnesses called could be these two survivors, the two former students who are accusing the teacher?
Absolutely. So, if for the most part, they have to testify. There are certain ways around it if you really needed to get around hearsay exceptions on these kinds of cases where you can have other people testify on their behalf. But for the most part, the only way that the prosecution is going to really be able to secure a conviction, because remember, in a criminal case, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not, preponderance of the evidence, which is more likely than not. Beyond a reasonable doubt basically means that the prosecution has to prove almost certainly that this happened in the way that they're saying it happened. And so, in order to reach that level of proof, you really do need the people that it happened to testify. So, yes, if it goes to trial, I do anticipate that the victims will testify.
With Townsend's background as a sex crimes prosecutor, I asked her about a potential motive in this case and others like it. And one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you today specifically is because you have a history of prosecuting cases like this, these sex crimes. Do you have any idea what goes into the mind of these teachers who, again, we've talked about this, they have the training, they've gone through it, they know that this is illegal, morally unethical, but also illegal. So, what makes them take the leap from a student to a lover?
My God, I honestly don't know. You're right. I've done this so many times. I've prosecuted these cases so many times, and I still don't understand what goes through the minds of these teachers. I don't know if it just feels, I don't know if it's this feeling that they're flattered, and just they have like this issue. Maybe they're self-conscious as a person and they like feeling impressive. They like to be in that role, and it's just interesting to them. Or I don't know. I really don't. But we do see it so often that it's very alarming, because you can't understand why somebody would do that. You're an adult, you're in a position of trust, in a position of power. You've, like you said, been trained to not be this way. And I don't know. I just, if it's the thrill of the act itself, but it's really alarming, and the fact that we are seeing it often is even more alarming. And I do think, because of technology, is one of the reasons why we are catching it more rather than be in the past.
Townsend says we're still in the early stages of Rizzitello's case, and we could expect to see many more updates as it makes its way through the judicial system.
I do wonder kind of what the judge is going to do with respect to bail, and with respect to, finding out about this additional accuser, and whether she's going to be remanded or if she's going to be out while the trial is pending. Those things are very interesting. And again, you never know. Sometimes when the floodgates open, you do see more accusers come forward. So I guess time will tell to see if we hear from more of her students in the future.
Rizzitello is still being held in jail, but is set to appear in court this week. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.